Hello, welcome to my channel and also my bedroom. I'm Braxton, and today I want to talk about Marvel and more specifically Marvel Phase 4. I think it's safe to say that some fans have started to lose faith in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. For over 10 years and 23 movies, the MCU was sort of a phenomenon. Marvel created a unique path by creating an interwoven cinematic universe unlike anything before it. Each movie built on one another and created a more rich world for the next movie to take place in. What makes this feat even more impressive is the consistent quality of these films. While the films weren't perfect and some weren't great, Marvel never had a truly bad film. Even Thor: The Dark World, which most would consider the worst Marvel film, is usually regarded as mediocre, subpar, or uninteresting. I think any film franchise with even half the number of movies that Marvel has would be pleased to say that their worst film is only mediocre. With that being said, after the Infinity Saga wrapped up with Endgame and Far From Home, the discussion around the MCU has sort of been a little more mixed. After the events of Endgame, Marvel has been taking more risks. In particular, the studio has been experimenting with new forms of media and a variety of new tones and genres for their films and shows. While specific movies in the Infinity Saga certainly had their own distinct flares, for the most part, all of the movies felt consistent. When you went to see a Marvel movie, you kinda had an idea of what you were going to get. I'm not saying this as a negative. I love the Infinity Saga, but now that it's over, Marvel has tried to stray away from their more formulaic past. Overall, the new phase of the MCU has felt more unhinged, for the lack of a better word. Sure, some of the movies have kept that classic Marvel style, but I would argue that for the most part, the movies and shows in Phase 4 have been different, to say the least. Though I'm not the biggest fan of everything that Marvel has put out during this phase, I'm actually kind of glad that they are straying away from their normal formula and taking more risks. So what I want to do is go through everything that Marvel has released in Phase 4 and kind of hit on what I enjoyed in those properties and also what I thought that they did that was unique or kind of risky for an MCU film. First up is WandaVision. WandaVision started Phase 4 off with a bang. I think a lot of people look back on WandaVision a little more negatively than it really deserves. I think a lot of that can be blamed on the somewhat anticlimactic finale, but in reality, the show probably had more buzz during its release than any of the other Marvel Disney Plus shows. Putting Wanda and Vision in a sitcom format was so interesting and intriguing that every fan had like 20 different theories of why it was happening. When episode 4 released, and sort of pulled the rug out from a lot of the mystery of the show, I was a bit scared, but I honestly think that the show continued to work really well. It never really let up on its twists and turns. You still always had the question of how Vision was just there and alive, and you wondered how Quicksilver was back from the dead, but also from the Fox universe for some reason. And you had Tommy and Billy join in on the fun, and of course Darcy and Monica and Jimmy were all awesome, and I think the Agatha reveal was super cool. Sure, the show isn't perfect, but you can't deny that it had you on the edge of your seat the whole time because you were just questioning what was going on. Obviously, not everything paid off perfectly. I'm looking at you, Ralph Boner, but regardless, the show was extremely unique. It got fans excited, it fleshed out Wanda and Vision, it added new and interesting characters to the mix. I think we all remember our disappointment with Ralph Boner and the lack of Mephisto for those of you who were really wanting that, and how the finale of the show didn't end with a graceful superhero landing, but I think when you really look back at it, you'll realize that this show was pretty incredible. And then the Falcon and the Winter Soldier kind of went right back to what you'd expect from the MCU. Look, I'm not gonna lie, this show is probably my least favorite of all the Disney Plus shows from Marvel, but I don't think it's bad. I like a lot of what it brings to the table, but man, I just could not care less about the Flag Smashers. I really think that if the bad guys in this show were more compelling, it would have been really well received by fans, but most people seem to see this show as forgetful and mid. I can't really say I disagree with that assessment, but there are a lot of things in the show that I appreciated, so let's talk about that. First off, I love Sam Wilson taking up the mantle of Captain America, and I also love seeing both him and Bucky struggle to live up to Steve. Steve had more faith in them than they have in themselves, and I think that that dynamic is extremely heartfelt and relatable. I love seeing them come to terms with their identities throughout the season, and I also think that the Isaiah Bradley storyline was both fascinating and heartbreaking. I love that the show didn't completely shy away from the tragic treatment of black people both in America's past and in its present. These things need to be talked about, and while I don't think that the show necessarily gave the subject the time and care that it needs and deserves, I do appreciate that Marvel was at least willing to acknowledge these problems. I hope this is proof of a step in the right direction for Marvel Studios as a whole to progressively use its platform to speak up about injustices. Another thing I loved about the show was the reintroduction of Zemo. I mean, who did not love seeing Zemo do his little dance? While I loved all of these elements, the standout for me was actually probably John Walker. And I know what you're thinking, how could anyone love John Walker? Well, I think that he is an extremely interesting and dynamic character that makes you actually feel something. When he first walked onto screen with Cap's uniform, my blood was boiling. I think that a character making me feel such an intense emotion is proof of a pretty great character. John Walker was so much fun to root against, but despite all of his flaws, he truly felt that he was doing the best anyone could have possibly done as the new Captain America. And sure, his intentions were good, but compared to Steve, it's clear that he's no fit for the role. When he murdered the Flag Smasher with the shield, my jaw dropped. I think that a character like John Walker is a fascinating addition to the MCU, and I can't wait to see what they do with him next. Overall, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier might not have been the most memorable show in the world, but I think that it had some really special elements in it, and I still enjoy it for what it is. I believe that Loki is the most well-received of all of the Disney Plus shows, and I fully understand why. Tom Hiddleston absolutely kills it as the lead, Owen Wilson was a ton of fun, and introducing the ideas of timelines and multiverses into the MCU is a crucial part of this phase and also the Marvel Universe as a whole. I don't think anyone would deny that Loki is a unique and welcomed addition to the MCU. Much like WandaVision, Loki did a great job at keeping you guessing where the story was going to go next. But while WandaVision's ending was a bit rocky, I think that Loki's finale was the perfect payoff. You get all the answers that you were looking for, and even more importantly, you get the introduction of Kang. I'm not a big comic book reader, but from what I have heard, Kang could possibly be the next Avengers level threat of the MCU. I personally am extremely excited about that. I could go on and on about how awesome Loki is and how excited I am to see where they take his character next, but I don't think I need to convince anyone that this show is both amazing and different from anything else that the MCU has put out. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the first Phase 4 movie. From what I can tell, Black Widow seems to be perceived as a mid-tier Marvel movie. It has its lovers and it has its haters, but most people fall somewhere in between. I also fall somewhere in between, though I do tend to lean a little more positive on this film. And I think the reasoning for this lean could be summed up in two words: Yelena Belova. Man, Florence Pugh is so charismatic in this role. I love Natasha as a character, but I think that the best thing this movie did was set up Yelena to replace her after what happened to her in Endgame. I also just loved seeing David Harbour in the MCU. I don't know if his character will ever be brought back, but I certainly would not be against it. Now, this film definitely has its issues. For one, I think that Taskmaster was handled very poorly. I actually like the idea of Taskmaster being a woman. I just think that it's super weird that they didn't give her actual powers. Making her abilities come from a computer program feels strange and also raises the question about why the other widows don't also use that technology. And of course, the pheromones plot line feels very out of left field. I don't mind goofy plot points in my fictional superhero movies, but this definitely caught me a bit off guard. But even with those issues, possibly the biggest problem I have with this movie is the fact that it takes place in Phase 4. Black Widow should have come out between Civil War and Infinity War, and I think everyone kind of knows it. I want to care about Natasha's story in this movie, but I can't help but feel a bit disconnected because I already know what happens to her character in the present day. I love the idea of fleshing out Natasha Romanoff, but what's the point if her big character arc is essentially revealed in a 2-hour posthumous flashback? It just feels strange. I'm glad that Scarlett Johansson got her big movie. She deserves it. I mean, she's been here since Iron Man 2, but I wish she would have gotten it before her character's demise. I didn't really mean to rant about this movie so much. Like I said, I still feel pretty positive about it, but this film sticks pretty close to your typical MCU property, so I don't feel like it really enriches the MCU like a lot of the other properties in Phase 4. Despite this, I still think the movie was worth it for Yelena Belova alone. I think What If perfectly encapsulates what I mean when I say that Phase 4 is the phase where the MCU is taking a lot more risks and adding more variety to its brand. One thing I like about What If is that no one really seems to agree on what episodes were good and which episodes were bad. I love seeing how people ranked the episodes because almost every list was entirely different. I personally enjoyed all of the episodes. I definitely liked certain ones more than others, but I felt like the show is a breath of fresh air for the MCU. I enjoyed the hypothetical nature of the show, and I especially appreciated the animation. I'm a sucker for animation in general, so seeing it in the MCU is super exciting to me. Obviously, the show is unlike anything else in the MCU, and I love that Marvel was willing to take a risk on a show like this. I don't know anyone who dislikes Shang-Chi. I find Wenwu to be one of the most compelling villains of all of the Marvel movies. Some of the best action sequences in the MCU are in this movie, and I just think that the overall film is a blast. Similar to Black Widow, this movie didn't feel like a huge risk for the MCU. It had the vibe of the Infinity Saga movies, but I think that that vibe was the right one for this movie. Not everything has to be this crazy new, never done before piece of media. I appreciated that the movie felt like a good old-fashioned Marvel film. This film proves that just because Marvel is changing things up in Phase 4, that doesn't mean that it can't still deliver on the movies that fans have grown to love. Shang-Chi feels like a natural addition to this universe. I don't have many negatives about this film, I just find it to be a lot of fun to be in the world of Shang-Chi. Okay, so The Eternals is the only property in Phase 4 that I didn't really like. It's so fascinating to me that people are so polarized about this movie. Some people absolutely love it and some people absolutely hate it. I don't hate the movie, but like I said, I'm not the biggest fan of it. I don't want to stay on this film too long because I hate when someone tries to convince me of all of the flaws in something that I love. So instead, I'm just going to hit on some of the things that I did appreciate about this film. At times, I find this movie to be one of the prettiest films in the entire MCU. I appreciated a lot of individual character moments, but in terms of characters, I especially enjoyed Gilgamesh and Makari. And I'm also looking forward to seeing what they do with Kit Harington's character in the MCU. Harry Styles was in this movie, so, you know, we'd love to see that. His character seems to be really interesting in the comics, so I want to see what they end up doing with him as well. And I guess I also respect that this movie didn't feel like a Marvel film at all. At this point, most of the movies and shows somewhat rely on pre-existing characters and stories to build off of. This movie didn't do that. Other than a brief mention of Thanos, this movie, I believe, could pretty much be a standalone film. You don't need any knowledge of the other movies to fully understand what's going on in this one. I think that's a unique direction to take this film because we are in such a late stage of the MCU and everything seems to be so connected. I think that they actually reference DC characters just as much, if not more, than they reference Marvel characters, which is just mind-blowing to me. You know, I think that this movie has a lot in common with The Last Jedi, and while neither of these films are my cup of tea, you gotta respect that they don't try to meet fan expectations. Rian Johnson and Chloe Zhao, respectively, each followed their own artistic vision, and they created the films that they wanted to make. Regardless of your opinion of Eternals, It was certainly another unique entry into the MCU. Hawkeye is probably the most rewatchable of the Disney Plus shows for me. It's just a lot of fun to hang out with Clint and Kate. I'm so excited that Haley Steinfeld's in the MCU, and I'm glad that they didn't really retire Clint and Barton in this show. I was worried going into it that this would be the final adventure that we see Clint on, but it didn't really feel that way to me at least. I'm hoping to see a lot more from both Clint and Kate in the future. I think Echo is an interesting addition to the MCU, and I can't wait to see if her solo show ties into the Marvel Netflix shows like everyone says it will by bringing in Daredevil. Whether or not that happens, Hawkeye does confirm that the Marvel Netflix shows are at least somewhat canon because we see Kingpin come in towards the end of the show. I feel a little mixed on Kingpin's characterization in this show, but I couldn't help but be excited whenever I saw him walk on screen. I actually think that this show felt like the perfect mix between the Netflix shows and the Marvel Disney Plus shows. I'm really glad that Hawkeye was able to kind of carve that space out for itself. I always enjoyed the more street level superheroes in the MCU, and I think that Hawkeye did a really good job at exploring what it's like to be a street level Avenger. Oh, and obviously I can't move on from this show without mentioning Yelena Belova. She was perfect as expected, and her and Kate's interactions were probably some of my favorite moments of the entire show. Overall, the show wasn't an MCU shattering entry, but it's an extremely fun and charming show, and it did a great job at starting to bridge the gap between the Marvel Netflix shows and the rest of the MCU. Spider-Man is my favorite superhero, but while I love Tom Holland in the role, I always thought that the Peter Parker in the MCU felt slightly off. That opinion isn't unique. You can find tons of videos talking about the critiques that people have of Spider-Man in the MCU. But for me, No Way Home kind of fixes all of those issues. No Way Home kind of reveals that the entire MCU Spider-Man trilogy was just an origin story. And surprisingly, that really worked for me. With the ending of No Way Home, no longer does anyone know who Peter Parker is, and by doing this, Spider-Man is finally fully out of Tony Stark's shadow. He can no longer reveal on all of his Avenger friends, and he doesn't have an amazing relationship with MJ anymore. Peter is back to being the underdog. On top of taking Peter back to the roots of his character, No Way Home also finally delivers Peter's "with great power comes great responsibility" moment with that gut-wrenching scene with Aunt May. For me, all of these elements that are completely changing the characterization of the MCU Spider-Man culminate at the end of the movie as we see Peter swinging across New York in his classic Spider-Man costume. It's like the film is winking at me saying, hey man, here's your Spider-Man. I got chills. For me, the character is finally where I've wanted him to be since he was introduced in Civil War. This new characterization of the MCU Spider-Man is not the only thing that is awesome about this movie though. Obviously, bringing in the other Spider-Men and their villains into the MCU was awesome. With this phase having a lot to do with multiverses, I think that there could not have been a better time to attempt something as wacky as this. I was worried that bringing back Tobey and Andrew would kind of feel forced and fan servicey, but I think that the movie pulled it off perfectly. Like, Tobey and Andrew's Spider-Man actually moved Tom Holland's character forward in a way that felt organic. I have my nitpicks about this movie, but I don't think that they really matter. At the end of the day, it gave me everything I could have ever wanted out of a live-action multiversal Spider-Man movie while also correcting all of the issues that I had with the MCU's Spider-Man. This movie is a spectacle. It's probably the closest thing that Spider-Man will ever get to his own solo in-game event, and I think it was near perfect. Clearly, I love this movie and everything that it does for the MCU, so I'm gonna go ahead and move on to the next thing. Moon Knight is another banger of a show. For me, Moon Knight's actually on the same level as Loki in terms of quality. I really wish that this show would have gotten more traction because I found it to be phenomenal. Mark Spector and Stephen Grant are such unique and interesting characters, and having your protagonist feel almost like an unreliable narrator was a ton of fun. I was never fully sure of what was real and what was just made up. I mean, even after watching the show, the line is still slightly blurred because as an audience, we know that both Stephen and Jake Lockley were originally just forms of Mark's imagination. I mean, clearly each of them do each have their own thoughts and feelings and lives, but I love that that element of uncertainty is still there. Obviously, Moon Knight is a very unique entry into the MCU as it dives into mental disorders and Egyptian mythology. Along with this, like Eternals, Moon Knight feels like it could also kind of be a solo property. There aren't any cameos or references to the greater MCU. This show tells a story of its own and doesn't really worry about furthering the overall Marvel narrative. With that being said, I really hope that they continue to tell stories with Moon Knight in them. I find him to be an extremely intriguing character, and I love the distinct feeling and touch that he brings to the MCU. When I left the theater for Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, I thought to myself, that was a lot of fun. But I think that the more that time passes, the more unsure I am about how I feel about this movie. I'll go ahead and get my big gripe out of the way first. I didn't really like the characterization of Wanda in this film. I think Elizabeth Olsen did a phenomenal job, as always, but I kind of felt like a lot of the progression that Wanda's character had in WandaVision was sort of ignored or thrown away in this film. I get that the reason that she went full evil mode is because of the Darkhold, but for me, that just felt like sort of cheap and an easy way to get Wanda to murder a bunch of people. Don't get me wrong, I recognize that they teased the Darkhold twist at the end of WandaVision, but regardless, what they did with Wanda in this film just felt kind of sloppy to me. I know some people love the characterization of Wanda, and I'm really happy that it worked for you, but for me, it just didn't. Nonetheless, I still feel mostly positive about this film. I think that Doctor Strange himself was handled extremely well in this movie. I love the idea that Doctor Strange's urge to always do things the way that he wants to do them is actually quite dangerous and destructive. It adds a neat layer of depth to his character, and it was really cool to see that explored in this film. Another thing I really appreciated about this film was that you could really feel Sam Raimi's influence. I like that Marvel is allowing their directors to add their own flares and sense of style to their films. I think James Gunn and Taika Waititi are both great examples of why this excites me. The Guardians films and Thor Ragnarok both benefit from having the fingerprints of their directors, and similarly, I would argue that this film benefits from having Sam Raimi's influence on it. I love that Marvel didn't shy away from being a little scary. This film probably pushes the limits of the PG-13 rating more than any of the other MCU properties. I think it's really cool that Marvel is trusting its creators to do that. In addition to these positives, I also really like bringing America Chavez into the MCU. I think her character has a lot of potential for future storylines, and I feel like I have to mention the Illuminati cameos. I enjoyed those scenes. I thought they were a lot of fun. I love seeing John Krasinski, but I will say that I'm kind of unsure if I feel like he fits the role of Mr. Fantastic now. Before this movie, I was all for it, but I'm a little more mixed on the idea at this point. I don't know. We'll see if he actually gets cast as our universe's Reed Richards. Either way, I won't be that upset, but back to the movie as a whole, while I didn't love Wanda's characterization in this film, I did think that it had a lot of special elements to it and continued to confirm that the MCU is willing to take more innovative risks for this phase. We have finally made it to the final Phase 4 project that has come out thus far. As of now, Ms. Marvel has released, I believe, 4 episodes, so as of writing this script, that's all I'm aware of. This show's not performing well, and I'm not okay with that. This show is extremely charming. Aman Vellani is fantastic as Kamala Khan, and the exploration of Pakistani and Muslim culture is both extremely well done and incredibly interesting. As someone who knew absolutely nothing about either of these cultures before going into the show, I really feel like the show has taught me a lot. Because the show is still releasing episodes, I don't want to go too in depth, partly because of spoilers, but also just because I don't think I can fully analyze a show without all of its episodes being released. But so far, I'm really enjoying the show, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they do with the rest of the episodes. Please give this show a chance. I absolutely love it so far. So those are the things that I have appreciated about the MCU's Phase 4. Do I think that this phase has been perfect? No. Do I think that it's been consistent? No. Directionless? Yes, but I haven't really lost my interest or trust in Marvel Studios because of this phase. I completely understand people who are burnt out on this franchise. It's a lot of content, it doesn't really seem to be going anywhere, and of course that's going to lead to an oversaturation of the Marvel brand for a lot of people. Like I said, I do get it, but I think that if you separate each Phase 4 property from that Marvel burnout, you'll see that Marvel hasn't really lost its touch, it's just trying new things. The most frequent complaint I heard about Marvel during the Infinity Saga was that it was too formulaic. Now Marvel seems to be changing that, and while it doesn't seem to be working for everyone, I personally am really enjoying the risks that Marvel is taking in this new phase. Alright everyone, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. Please, if you did enjoy the video, subscribe, like, comment, all of that jazz. I will hopefully see you in the next one. I've been Braxton. Peace out.